Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that's often forgotten amid the chaos of tanks, trenches, and total war. What did World War II soldiers actually eat, from American Croatians to German Zot, spread Soviet cabbage soup to Japanese rice balls? Tonight we re-peeling back the layers of history, one can of corned beef at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you re-tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Before a single shot was fired, before tanks rumbled across Europe or planes screamed overhead, every army faced one universal unglamorous challenge: feeding its soldiers without killing them in the process. Let's be honest, when we think of World War II, we imagine battles, bravery, and black and white newsreels. Rarely do we stop to ask the really gritty questions like, did that guy storming Normandy have breakfast? And if so, what on earth was it? Spoiler, it wasn't pancakes. Feeding millions of soldiers across scattered battlefields wasn't just a logistical feat, it was a quiet war within the war. A daily struggle between sustenance and survival. The meals had to be compact, durable, and reliable. They couldn't spoil, couldn't attract pests, and ideally wouldn't traumatize anyone. Flavor, though, was rarely invited to the table. It was often an afterthought somewhere between one tea crumble in a backpack and one to poison the troops. Each nation tackled the problem in its own peculiar way. The Americans turned to science, packaging hope into tidy cardboard containers known as rations. In the early days, German soldiers marched with wholesome meat and rye, but as the war dragged on, they received more and more canned despair. The British, no matter how bleak the battlefield, clung to their tea as though the empire itself depended on the ritual. Perhaps it did. Meanwhile, the Soviets boiled cabbage with near religious devotion, and Japanese soldiers were often expected to endure hunger, marching with nothing but rice balls and stoic resolve. Food, of course, was more than nourishment. It was the difference between despair and endurance. A warm bite could comfort the soul, while a cold tin of mystery meat could deflate it entirely. Some soldiers learned to love their rations. Others developed long-standing culinary trauma. Many longed not for medals, but for fresh bread and warm butter. And while officers mapped battle plans in quiet war rooms, the men in trenches swapped cigarettes for candy and whispered prayers for anything that tasted like home. So tonight, we're not talking about battles won or borders redrawn. We're talking about Spam, crackers, powdered eggs, and a real war between soldiers and the strange, suspicious contents of their ration tins. Because if there's one universal truth about war, it's that everyone has to eat, even if the food fights back. Now imagine you're a U.S. soldier. You've hiked miles in wet socks, survived a near miss from artillery, and you haven't seen plumbing in what feels like years. Your stomach growls like a distant tank. What do you receive? The Croatian, a small box of determination, disguised as food, designed by someone who probably never had to eat it. There were 3 meals: breakfast, lunch, and dinner, each packed into a block that felt more like a brick than a blessing. Inside was just enough to qualify as nutrition. The emotional cost, however, was something else entirely. Breakfast offered ham and eggs. At least that's what the label claimed. What you opened was a pale imitation, a blend of Spam and spackle. Add in crackers hard enough to file your nails on, a packet of powdered lemonade that defied logic, instant coffee, and 2 sticks of gum. You even got 4 cigarettes and 1 precious square of toilet paper. Just one. Use it wisely. Lunch didn't lift your spirits either. A tin of cheese product more chemistry than Dairy More jaw-breaking biscuits, and a chocolate bar with the consistency of military-grade rubber. No spoon included, naturally. You used whatever you had. A bayonet, a piece of wood, maybe just grim determination. Dinner? A can of meat and beans that resembled something found at a crime scene. And more of those crackers, more gum, and if the universe was kind, a fruit bar so bland it made cardboard seem festive. And yet, for all their shortcomings, creations were engineered masterpieces. Roughly 3,000 calories a day, protein, sugar, fat, just enough flavor to keep morale from evaporating entirely. Soldiers traded components like kids at a lunch table, chocolate for cigarettes, cheese for crackers, anything to escape another ham and egg encounter. Every so often, tucked among the misery, was a real Hershey's bar. Just one square could bring you home, if only for a moment. That small comfort in the mud and cold was everything. So yes, the creation was dry, weirdly square, and kind of tasted like war. But in the end, it was the fuel that helped win a global conflict, one questionable meat product at a time. If the creation was the military's interpretation of a meal, the D ration was its idea of a cruel joke dressed as dessert. At first glance, it looked inviting, a chocolate bar, wrapped neatly and promising sweetness. But this was no Hershey's. It was a wartime illusion. The D ration had three purposes. It wouldn't melt, it wouldn't spoil, and most importantly, it wouldn't taste good. It was designed to discourage casual snacking. Roughly the size of a deck of cards, and dense enough to double as a blunt weapon, the D ration was both survival food and passive-aggressive engineering. Ingredients included chocolate, sugar, oat flour, and just enough cocoa fat to technically qualify it as edible. The result was a grim brown slab that seemed like it might do better as building material. Its texture could chip a tooth. Some soldiers grated it into boiling water. Others stared at it, unsure if it was a mistake. A few, according to rumor, used it as a hammer. But it had calories, 600 per bar, just enough to drag your body through another day. If you were stranded, outnumbered, or down to your last hope, the D ration could save your life. It just wouldn't lift your spirits. Eventually, the Army recognized that chocolate designed to double as body armor wasn't helping morale. Later versions softened the formula. A little, but the damage was done. Soldiers remembered that bar the way most of us remember dental work, with a wince and a promise to never go back. So next time you hear someone say, chocolate makes everything better, remember the D ration, the chocolate bar that proved them wrong. If the creation was survival food and the D ration was edible punishment, then the field kitchen was a fleeting taste of something closer to real life. These rolling mess halls, hauled behind trucks or mules, were the military's attempt at comfort served in ladles. Known affectionately or not as rolling misery carts, field kitchens delivered something warm, something almost familiar. From steel pots came vats of thick stew, bubbling beans, and substances labeled as gravy. And of course, coffee black, bitter, and brewed strong enough to rouse the unconscious. Mealtime was a ritual. Soldiers lined up, mess kits and hand-cold steel trays, waiting to catch whatever the kitchen had prepared. You shuffled forward in the mud, watching the steam rise in the air, hoping the guy in front of you didn't take the last bite as something vaguely meat-adjacent. The offerings varied. In Europe, you might get creamed chipped beef on toast cheerfully dubbed SOS, or, in less polite terms, stuff on a shingle. In the Pacific, rice with chopped hot dogs, swimming in a mysterious broth. But coffee was always present, sacred even. Troops drank it hot, cold, thick with powdered milk, or straight black. As long as it worked, no one complained. The best part of the whole experience was the smell, that soft, drifting promise of warmth and fullness. The worst part? Everything else. Meals were eaten in the rain, in snow, in mud that swallowed boots. You sat on helmets, on rocks, or on nothing at all. Forks? Optional. Hope? Required. So yes, the creation was dry, weirdly square, and kind of tasted like war. But in the end, it was the fuel that helped win a global conflict, one questionable meat product at a time. There was no ambiance, just you, your friends, and a tin of beans that might be older than your commanding officer. Still, when it was hot and vaguely chewable, field kitchen food felt like heaven. It wasn't glamorous, but in a world of chaos, bullets, and creations, it was the closest thing to comfort food. At the start of World War II, German soldiers marched with confidence, polished boots, and something most soldiers across Europe envied: actual food. In those early days, Wehrmacht rations bordered on luxurious. While other armies braced for saltless crackers and mystery meat, the average German pack carried rye bread, sausage, butter, cheese, tinned meat, marmalade, and coffee. Or rather, what passed for coffee at topic will return to gently, and with the weariness it deserves. Every man was expected to carry his own supply for a few days. In theory, this was practical. In reality, it added significant weight to already overloaded soldiers. Rifles, grenades, extra clothes, and now several pounds of calories on your back. Yet the principle stood: 3 warm meals a day, supported by field kitchens that clunked along behind the lines like loyal but overworked food carts. Breakfast might mean dense slices of rye bread with butter or jam and a steaming cup of roasted acorn coffee. Lunch came in the form of tinned meats and cheese, with perhaps a boiled potato or two. Dinner, when you weren't being shelled, was often a warm stew or soup made from whatever could be spared. Sausages were everywhere. Meckwurst, Leberwurst, staples of German comfort, filling and familiar. Their smell lingered in the trenches, combining with sweat and metal into a strangely nostalgic perfume. And then there was bread, soft, real, and deeply missed once it disappeared. One soldier later recalled it as the only softness in an otherwise sharp war. The field kitchens did their part, doling out dumplings, stews, and meaty broths to keep morale upright and hunger at bay. For a time, it worked. Bellies were full, and German logistics seemed precise, even elegant. But nothing golden lasts forever. As the war stretched eastward and deep into winter, the warm sausage glow faded. Supply lines frayed. Field kitchens sputtered out in forests where roads gave way to frost and isolation. Food quality plummeted. The sausage was sour, the bread was stale, and soldiers were left with little more than cold tins and memories of butter. Still, for a short, brat-filled chapter of the war, the German soldier had a rare gift: warm meals, even if only a few. With ersatz coffee in hand and something hot in the bowl, it felt briefly like a war you could survive, and maybe even go home from by Christmas. As the months dragged on, blitzkrieg turned into gridlock, and German rations tumbled from hearty to haunting. The word of the moment became Satz, meaning substitute, a fitting name for food that wasn't really food. Coffee was one of the first to go. Real beans disappeared behind military needs and shipping bottlenecks. In their place came Zatzkaffee, an improvised blend of roasted acorns, barley, sugar beet, and disappointment. It smelled like burnt twigs and tasted like a war crime in a mug. If you'd never had coffee before, you might not know the difference, but if you had, the betrayal ran deep. Bread turned too. No longer the proud, dark loaves of Bavarian kitchens. It now included sawdust, straw, potato starch, and whatever ground-up filler could be mashed into dough. Some joked it made better helmet lining than breakfast. Butter vanished. Its stand-in Zatz margarine was an unpleasant, greasy spread that clung to everything but flavor. Meat became elusive. Cans arrived marked only meat product, an intentionally vague label. Sausages lost their soul. What was once pork became part horse, part turnip, part sad guesswork. Up to 40% of some sausages were now plant filler. Imagine biting into bratwurst and encountering something that tasted like wet paper. It was food in name only. Beyond flavor, the real danger was malnutrition. Zat's food didn't carry enough calories, protein, or hope. On the Eastern Front, where soldiers burned thousands of calories just to stay warm, these meals offered nothing close to survival. Hunger became constant. Soldiers boiled boots. They traded soap, buttons, anything for a real meal. Even a single American chocolate bar became treasure. The Reich had started the war with precision. It was ending it on cabbage water and caffeine lies. They'd entered battle fueled by rye and sausage. They were ending it chewing bark and hoping not to freeze. Nowhere was this truer than the Eastern Front, where rations died slowly and soldiers went hungry in slow, silent agony. Imagine trying to run a food delivery service across an iced-over battlefield the size of a continent while being shot at from every direction. This was Germany's logistical problem, and soldiers paid the price in hunger, frostbite, and a growing hatred for every can they opened. The hearty meals of the early war gave way to bitter, frozen defeat. Canned meat arrived solid. Bread, when it showed up, was stale or moldy. Sometimes, soldiers burned scarce firewood just to thaw a can of meat, not even knowing what animal had donated itself to the cause. Labels peeled away. You'd sniff and hope. If it didn't smell like despair, you ate it. Water was another challenge. It came as snow-pure, white, and lethal. Eating snow might seem harmless, but it sapped body heat and brought men one step closer to freezing. Rats thrived where men didn't. Plump, bold, and unafraid, they often competed with soldiers for scraps. Some were hunted, cooked, and eaten. Others were simply tolerated, grudgingly, like furry black market dealers of misery. Trade flourished, not in markets, but in trenches, foxholes, and frozen barns. A sock might get you a spoonful of jam. A boiled egg, worth a pair of gloves. Chocolate made you a king. Soldiers bartered and begged, cobbling together meals from scraps and desperation. And yet, they endured. They made jokes. They told stories. They opened each tin with a quiet hope that it might not smell too awful. And in those freezing, hopeless fields, food became not just a necessity, but a ritual of survival. If German troops on the Eastern Front were eating misery, Soviet soldiers were chewing on sheer willpower. The Red Army's approach to nutrition was simple. If it filled your stomach and didn't kill you immediately, it was dinner. Official rations included black bread, cabbage soup, porridge, a few boiled potatoes, maybe a sliver of dried fish, and unsweetened tea. Or more often, snow water warmed over fire with a stick in it for flavor. Meat appeared on paper, but almost never in reality. When it did, it was salted stiff, like a chew toy for grown men in uniform. Yet it was precious. Even the fat clinging to old cans was licked clean like a delicacy. Bread was sacred black, coarse, and fleeting. A ration could vanish in seconds unless stretched with slow, deliberate bites, as if licking each crumb preserved the memory of better times. Some soldiers cradled their bread like treasure. Cabbage, though, reigned supreme. It was soup. It was stew. It was pickled, fermented, shredded, or boiled into submission. Soviet troops joked about turning into vegetables in their dreams. Anything to escape the eternal presence of cabbage in every meal. Still, hunger clung to them. Daily rations became, when possible, rations. And when they didn't come at all, soldiers turned resourceful. They foraged across burned-out villages, digging frozen potatoes from ruined gardens. They bartered cigarettes or boots for eggs. Some even traded food with captured German soldiers' hunger. After all, blurred the lines between enemy and equal. Occasionally, small miracles happened. A shot deer, a forgotten tin, a loaf smuggled in by a friend. These moments were cherished, retold, and remembered long after the war. Because in a place where meals were made from snow and sorrow, A bite of real food was something close to grace. They endured malnourished, exhausted, but relentless. Soviet troops pressed forward on fumes and boiled cabbage, proving that sometimes what feeds a soldier isn't calories. It's pure cabbage-fueled stubbornness. When official rations ran dry, and they often did, Soviet soldiers didn't simply fade into quiet starvation. They adapted, loudly and inventively. With a mixture of desperation and resourcefulness, Red Army troops transformed survival into a grim culinary performance. It was an extreme sport of improvisation, determination, and occasionally eating like raccoons in uniform. Picture yourself as a soldier stationed outside Leningrad. You haven't seen a supply truck in over a week. Your soup, once proudly cabbage-based, now resembles warm water with a suspicious green leaf. Your last piece of black bread has sprouted fuzz and looks like it could argue back. So what do? Option 1. You forage. Soldiers combed the icy terrain, searching for anything that might be considered edible. Berries, flower bulbs, pine bark, dandelions, anything that didn't fight back. Some units even managed to soften and roast shoe leather. Not because it was tasty, it wasn't, but because it was technically chewable and didn't require translation. Option 2. You barter. A spare pair of socks could net you a small potato. A broken watch might fetch a spoonful lard. Tobacco had more currency than rubles, and soap was worth its weight in gold. If you were lucky enough to have a tin of meat, you might earn someone's undying gratitude, or at least their help cleaning your rifle. Option 3. Unauthorized logistics, also known as stealing. Soviet troops occasionally raided German outposts, not for intelligence, not for weapons, but for food. One Red Army veteran remembered finding a box of German sausages. He cried and salivated at the same time. That sausage, he later claimed, tasted like victory. When they worked, field kitchens were havens of mystery cooking. Into the pots went whatever could be found: beets, onions, pickled vegetables of questionable age, and the ever-elusive mystery meat. The result? A steaming, suspiciously chewy red stew that didn't ask for compliments, only your silence. And yet, somehow, morale didn't collapse. In fact, it endured. Soviet culture glorified struggle, and deprivation was reframed as endurance. Soldiers made jokes about their soup. They sang songs about their dried fish. They gave their mess kits names and spoke to them like friends. In the Red Army, mealtime wasn't about satisfaction. It was a ritual, a performance, a moment to declare, we are still here. If World War II had been judged by food alone, the British Army might have been forced to surrender to its own rations. British soldiers didn't eat. They endured. Every meal was a dry, unseasoned skirmish in the war for morale, fought with tea, stubbornness, and sarcastic commentary. Let's begin with the sacred trio: tea, hardtack biscuits, and bully beef. Tea was more than a beverage. It was therapy. It was Britishness in a cup. Soldiers brewed it in tin mugs, dented helmets, rusty kettles, and anything that could boil water without catching fire. Milk was a fantasy, sugar, a dream. Still, a steaming mug could silence a trench. It could summon calm amid shellfire. Hardtack biscuits were engineered to last longer than the soldier himself. Hard, dry, and nearly indestructible, they tasted like plaster and crumbled like chalk. They doubled as coasters, shims, or emergency building materials. Soldiers joked that they lost more teeth to these biscuits than to bullets. Then came bully beef, tinned corned beef that resembled sadness in gelatin form. Salty, greasy, and entirely indifferent to human taste buds, it could be eaten cold, fried, or emotionally surrendered to. Slice it, mash it, ignore it, bully beef remained, lurking in every ration tin like a culinary prank no one could escape. Other rations included powdered eggs that tasted nothing like eggs, jam that sealed jaws shut, oatmeal, chocolate, and the occasional dried fruit that had forgotten it was once food. Everything arrived in tins that required Herculean strength, blunt instruments, and spiritual resolve to open. British troops didn't pretend the food was good, only that it was ... food, mostly. Sometimes, if the stars aligned, field kitchens produced something warm, stewed prunes, boiled potatoes, or even gasp a slice of real bread. But even in the best conditions, nothing ever outshone the tea. If there was hot water, there was tea. That mug, clutched in trembling hands in a muddy trench, was the British spirit distilled into one sip. By the midpoint of the war, the greatest enemy wasn't the Axis, it was ration fatigue. Soldiers met yet another tin of bully beef with dead eyes and weary sarcasm. British supply chains, held together with paperwork and hope, sent strange meals across continents. A ration in Cairo might arrive warm. A ration in Burma, moldy, ant-bitten, and 2 weeks late. Still, it was accepted, heated, eaten, because that's what it meant to be British in uniform. Water was always boiled, not for safety alone, but because boiling meant tea. Men would crawl through sniper fire to retrieve a kettle. A warm mug could postpone collapse, restore pride, or remind a soldier that he was still human. Creativity flourished. Tea whitener from powdered milk. Jam on hardtack with a bayonet. Meat seasoned with sarcasm. One particularly daring soldier mixed bully beef with raisins and crushed vitamin tablets. The result was technically edible. Morally, debatable. Tinned food was both lifeline and torment. It survived everything, including taste. Some soldiers held deep philosophical debates over canned designs, good ones with key roll lids versus infernal tins that laughed in your face. On the rare occasion something fresh appeared, a real tomato, an egg, it was cause for celebration or suspicion. One soldier reportedly stared at a tomato for an hour, unsure whether to eat it or adopt it. In the end, he named it. And through all of it, through the mush and the metal and the meat that maybe wasn't, the British soldier endured. With calm, with sarcasm, with a spoon and a stiff upper lip. And always, always with tea. If the American soldier had rations, the German had order, and the Brit had tea, then the Japanese soldier had rice and the will to suffer for it. The Imperial Japanese Army was a machine powered by discipline and denial. Soldiers were taught to embrace hunger as a form of patriotism, which was fortunate because they were usually starving. The standard Japanese field ration was minimalist. A bundle of white rice, some barley, dried fish, a pickled plum, soy sauce concentrate, and maybe a few candies for morale. It was simple, portable, and at least initially culturally comforting. Meals were packed neatly in bento-style tins, wrapped in wax paper, ready for use. But once the soldiers entered the jungle, everything changed. In the steaming humidity of Burma or the dripping madness of Guadalcanal, rice turned to mush, fish rotted, and supplies vanished into the teeth of rats. Japanese logistics, never a strong point, collapsed entirely under pressure. Supply lines were bombed, broken, or never existed to begin with. Troops marched for days with only a handful of rice to share. Some found edible roots. Others chewed on leaves or boiled jungle plants that offered either mild nutrition or vivid hallucinations. In desperation, some soldiers turned to rats, lizards, insects, anything that moved. One survivor recalled a soup made from boiled grass and boot leather, just to quiet the growling within. And yet, astonishingly, complaints were rare. Endurance was seen as honor. Suffering was noble. Even a rice ball infested with weevils was accepted. It meant more protein. Sometimes miso paste or powdered green tea made its way through the chaos. These were treasured. A pinch of salt was enough to lift spirits. A teaspoon of tea could make a soldier close his eyes and remember home. But overall, calories remained few. Spirits were kept alive by pride and grit, not the food. The Japanese soldier wasn't just underfed. He was trained to be okay with it. And somehow, many of them kept fighting, not because of what was in their bellies, but because of what was in their minds. The jungles of the Pacific looked lush and green in the distance, like a tropical paradise, assuming you ignored the disease, the leeches, and the smell of slow death. But for soldiers on both sides, especially the Japanese, the jungle wasn't a source of food. It was a leafy green death trap thick with humidity, crawling with peril, and utterly indifferent human suffering. Supply lines in the Pacific were among the most unstable of the war. Tropical storms, naval blockades, enemy ambushes, and sheer distance all conspired to make every delivery of rice, beans, or saltfish a miniature miracle. And when the food didn't arrive, the jungle was no friend. Many Japanese units were stranded for weeks without resupply, forced to rely on the land. In theory, this was survival. In practice, the jungle was filled with plants that looked edible but weren't, animals that were edible but too fast, and insects that were not only inedible but actively hostile. Rations spoiled quickly. Canned goods rusted shut. Rice turned to mold before you could boil water. One soldier on Guadalcanal summed it up bleakly. Everything here is wet. Even my appetite is damp. When lucky, meals consisted of boiled roots, frogs, or the rare jungle bird. When not, they might involve rotting palm stems, shoe leather, or water flavored only by desperation. There were stories, whispered more than spoken, of soldiers boiling the same handful of rice multiple times just to extract a final whisper of sustenance. Others fermented leftovers into a gluey, half-dead porridge nicknamed jungle glue. And then there were the darker tailies accounts of cannibalism among the most isolated and starving units, especially during prolonged sieges. It wasn't common, but it did happen. War, starvation, and isolation strip away more than civility. They gnaw at the edges of the soul. Disease marched beside hunger. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, each one made worse by malnutrition and the jungle's humid grip. Soldiers collapsed not from bullets, but from infection and weakness, their bodies giving out quietly, invisibly. The jungle didn't feed you. It didn't protect you. It simply waited for you to tire, and then it swallowed you. Yet even in this grim tableau, there was a kind of twisted culinary brilliance. War destroys cities, but it also unlocks bizarre creativity in very hungry people with access to bayonets and cans of mystery meat. Across every front, soldiers didn't just eat, they negotiated, bartered, experimented, and occasionally laughed through mouthfuls of despair. In American foxholes, G is mashed K-ration crackers with powdered eggs and creamer, frying the mush into something that resembled a pancake, if not in taste, then at least in shape. Warm despair, they joked, was better than cold. Canned cheese became makeshift fondue when melted over beans. Spam ubiquitous, resilient was fried, diced, stacked between biscuits, or simply stared at until the urge to eat passed. Even gum had a role beyond chewing. It sealed canteens, patched holes, and acted as bribes. British troops, stoic and tea-fueled, turned indestructible hardtack into jam buddies sandwiches by smashing 2 biscuits, together with marmalade until their jaws surrendered. In North Africa, one squad famously combined bully beef and raisins into something they called Desert Delight. Another simply named their stew stuff, because no one could identify the ingredients anymore, not even the cook. On the Eastern Front, Soviet troops boiled cabbage in helmets, turned shell casings into soup pots, and roasted anything with legs. Once even a stolen German sausage, it became so coveted it needed armed protection. Japanese soldiers, ever resourceful despite their meager supplies, repurposed stale rice into fried cakes and used dried seaweed to flavor boiling water when everything else was gone. These weren't meals. They were wartime alchemy. They turned scarcity into just enough, turned boredom into morale, and turned a bayonet into a cooking tool. When you're huddled in a trench, crouched in a bombed-out farmhouse, or trudging through wet jungle, your mess kit becomes a sacred space. Your bayonet, a spatula. Your meal, a miracle. Long after the war ended, after the uniforms were folded and the medals packed away, what many veterans remembered most was the food. Or rather, the experience of food, the tastes, smells, and emotions that accompanied every bite. For them, rations weren't just sustenance. They were symbols. Symbols of hope, exhaustion, camaraderie, and survival. A bite of bully beef could conjure a rain-soaked trench in France. A whiff of cabbage soup could summon memories of the frozen outskirts of Stalingrad. A can of Spam wasn't just meat. It was a moment, a memory pressed into metal. Some veterans spoke of these meals with grim humor. American soldiers joked that D rations tasted like punishment. British troops shared tales of failed biscuit trades with unimpressed locals. A Soviet soldier once said he couldn't eat bread for years after the war, not out of hatred, but reverence. It had become sacred. Food marked the edge of life and death. A fresh apple meant you were near a farm, maybe peace. A steaming field stew meant today you'd live. Even bad coffee meant someone had taken the time to boil water for you. And then there were the care packages, those fragile, fragrant boxes from home, packed with chocolate, dried fruit, powdered milk, and tiny handwritten notes. They weren't just parcels. They were lifelines, emotional armor, hope preserved in wax paper and string. Some shared these treasures. Some saved them. Some rationed them out, bite by bite, across weeks of dread. And some never forgot them. Decades later, veterans claimed they could still taste the metal tongue of the tin. One GI swore he could smell Spam every time it rained. Another confessed that his dreams occasionally featured powdered eggs. Because in war, food is more than fuel. It becomes part of you. You're not just feeding your body. You're anchoring your identity. You're holding on to humanity one mouthful at a time. So the next time you heat up a snack or sip a cup of coffee, spare a moment for the soldier in the mud, cooking with firewood, a bayonet, and sheer will. For them, every bite was survival, and the taste, it never really left. The ink was barely dry on the U.S. Constitution when the young republic found itself brewing its first major crisis. One that came not from foreign invaders or political factions, but from something far more potent: whiskey. In the early 1790s, America was broke. The Revolutionary War had left the nation buried in debt, and the new federal government led by President George Washington and Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton needed a plan. Hamilton, ever the fiscal mastermind, proposed an excise tax on domestically produced distilled spirits, whiskey being the most common. To the urban elites and coastal merchants, it sounded reasonable. But on the western frontier, it sounded like a punch in the face from a powdered Whig aristocrat. Because what started as a tax protest was about to spiral into an armed uprising, one that would test the strength of the Constitution and Washington's resolve to enforce it. By 1792, the whiskey tax wasn't just unpopular, it was radioactive. In the backwoods communities of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Virginia, opposition was mutating from scattered grumbling into coordinated defiance. Tax collectors became familiar with two sounds: the clink of broken windows and the snap of gunfire overhead. The western counties of Pennsylvania emerged as the epicenter of what many now openly called rebellion. Meetings were held in taverns and log cabins, where kegs of homemade whiskey stood proudly beside flintlocks and muskets. These weren't just drunken complaints. They were organized, deliberate gatherings. Locals formed militias, issued threats to federal officials, and passed resolutions condemning the tax. Some communities even refused to do business with anyone who paid it. It was part protest, part mafia, and entirely steeped in corn liquor and contempt. In 1793, things escalated. Tax collectors and sympathizers were ambushed, whipped, or publicly humiliated. One unfortunate man was captured and paraded through town with a sign around his neck reading "Coward." This wasn't polite resistance. It was the Boston Tea Party, but soaked in whiskey and with far fewer bathhouses. The federal courts issued summonses in response, but enforcement was near impossible in counties where the sheriff was likely a cousin of the mob. The region was slipping into lawlessness, and the federal government couldn't ignore it forever. President George Washington, typically calm and reserved, began to grit his famously false teeth. The Whiskey Rebellion wasn't just a nuisance. It was threatening the very credibility of federal law. If the government couldn't enforce a tax, however unpopular, then what was the point of having a government at all? But Washington didn't rush. He sent negotiators to cool the situation, but the rebels had already formed their own committees, held conventions, and even discussed secession. They saw themselves as patriots standing against tyranny. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton was urging decisive action. Are we really going to let these guys stomp on the Constitution? He asked. Washington, weighing both sides, made his decision one that would shock the country and set a national precedent. He would raise a federal army and march it west. By 1794, the rebellion had morphed from regional protest into a full-blown test of national authority. George Washington, hero of the Revolution, now found himself preparing to lead an army against Americans, the very people he had once fought to free. This wasn't just a militia. Over 12,000 troops were assembled, nearly 3 times the size of Washington's force, at the Battle of Trenton. Volunteers and conscripts alike poured in from Maryland, New Jersey, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. It was the largest federal force ever assembled in the young republic. Hamilton, thrilled, rode out with the army like a powdered-wig version of General Patton. This was his moment proof that the federal government had teeth. Washington, more reluctant, understood the stakes. This wasn't about whiskey anymore. It was about law, legitimacy, and the survival of the Constitution. And so, for the first and only time in American history, a sitting president led troops in the field. Picture it, the most famous man in America on horseback, riding west through the Allegheny Mountains, not to inspire revolution, but to suppress one. His message was unmistakable. Rebellion would not be met with pamphlets. It would be met with bayonets. And then, anticlimax. As the army approached rebel territory, the uprising withered. The defiant voices that once roared in taverns turned to whispers. The rebels, realizing who was coming, fled. Some disappeared into the woods. Others claimed ignorance or domestic obligations. There was no grand battle, no dramatic stand. The army had marched for hundreds of miles to find a rebellion that evaporated like morning fog. Still, the message was clear. The federal government could and would assert itself. With order restored, Washington and his troops turned back. But the legal aftermath was just beginning. A handful of men were arrested and hauled to Philadelphia for trial. Most of the real agitators had vanished, leaving behind a few unlucky stragglers who had picked the wrong hiding spots. 20 were charged with treason, but justice was murky. Evidence was flimsy. Witnesses were reluctant. Juries, filled with locals, hesitated to hang neighbors. Only 2 men were convicted. Even those convictions seemed more symbolic than substantive. Washington, veteran of one rebellion, chose mercy. He pardoned both men. The government, he decided, must uphold law without becoming a tyrant. That clemency proved as important as the military display. The federal government had shown strength, but also restraint. Washington understood that legitimacy couldn't be earned by brute force alone. It had to be balanced with compassion. Hamilton, ever the hawk, grumbled that the common folk had been let off too easily. But Washington played the longer game. His aim wasn't punishment. It was preservation, and the lesson stuck. The rebellion was over, but the echoes would linger. The United States had passed its first great test of federal authority. It hadn't crumbled. It hadn't fractured. It had asserted itself, and done so with a surprising degree of grace. Yet the story wasn't finished. The aftermath of the Whiskey Rebellion left a political hangover that would ferment for years. While the federal government had proven its strength, it had also deepened existing rifts. At the center of the divide were two competing visions of America. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists' advocates of strong central government, industrial growth, and powdered wigs that could stop a musket ball. To them, the rebellion proved that order must be imposed. On the other side stood Jeffersonian Republicans, suspicious of central authority, defenders of the yeoman farmer and frontier independence. They saw the government's response not as justice, but as overreach. To these rural communities, sending 12,000 troops to crush a few whiskey makers felt like using a cannon to swat a gnat. Thomas Jefferson, then vice president, privately called the operation a monarchical adventure. He feared that Washington's actions had pushed the common man further from the federal government and deeper into Republican ranks. And indeed, after the rebellion, the Republican cause gained steam. In the hills and hollows where whiskey flowed, and government was often viewed with suspicion, Jefferson's message resonated. These weren't just drunk and angry farmers anymore. They were voters, and they were angry about being treated like a bunch of criminals for refusing a tax they could barely afford. The rebellion had failed militarily, but it succeeded in galvanizing anti-federalist sentiment. It helped accelerate the formation of the first true political parties in America, sharpening the divide between those who wanted a strong centralized state and those who wanted the states to call their own shots. So while no war had broken out, a new kind of battle had begun, one fought not with muskets and torches, but with ballots, speeches, and ideology. At its core, the Whiskey Rebellion wasn't just about booze. It was about power and class resentment. To the small farmers of western Pennsylvania and beyond, the whiskey tax was more than an annoying expense. It was a symbol of everything they feared about the new federal government, that it would be run by elites for elites at the expense of the working poor. Most of the rebellion's participants weren't outlaws. They were veterans of the Revolutionary War men who had fought and bled for a republic they now felt was turning its back on them. They returned home from the battlefields to find the very government they had helped create squeezing them dry, all while cozying up to Eastern bankers and merchants. It was like fighting a lion, only to come home and get kicked by the house cat. To make matters worse, many frontier folk felt excluded from the political process. Representation was lopsided. Their voices were drowned out by urban politicians who had never seen a cornfield and had no idea what life west of the Appalachians was like. The tax, which disproportionately punished small producers, didn't feel like policy. It felt like class warfare with the scent of fermenting mash. Wealthier distillers had lawyers, paperwork, and access to flat annual fees. The poor man with one copper still and 6 barrels of mash? He got a federal marshal and the threat of prison. The optics were awful, and the anger was genuine. The rebellion, in this light, became an early warning sign. Class tension, it turned out, didn't vanish just because the Constitution was signed. If anything, it had been baked into the structure. The Whiskey Rebellion was simply the first slice. Interestingly, some of the most radical rebels even borrowed language from the French Revolution, which was raging across the Atlantic at the time. They spoke of liberty, tyranny, and the rights of man. To Washington and Hamilton, that kind of rhetoric was terrifying. The last thing they wanted was a Paris-style uprising spilling into the Ohio Valley. But to the whiskey rebels, those words weren't radical. They were a promise one they believed had already been broken. George Washington's decision to personally lead troops into western Pennsylvania was bold and risky. At that time, many Americans saw the presidency as somewhat ceremonial, a dignified figurehead to balance the other branches. But Washington shattered that image. He wasn't just a leader. He was an enforcer of federal authority. For him, the rebellion wasn't merely about booze. It was a test of the Constitution's strength. If violence and intimidation could override legislation, then the entire federal system might unravel. The 13 states could easily fracture again into separate, squabbling powers. Washington's reputation gave the moment enormous weight. He was revered, respected, even mythologized. So when news spread that he was coming west on horseback, many rebels simply disappeared. They couldn't believe it. The hero of liberty, the general who beat the British, was now marching against American citizens over whiskey. But Washington's gamble worked. Without firing a shot, his presence alone restored order. And when that order was reestablished, he stopped. He didn't punish everyone. He didn't occupy the region. He didn't stage a dramatic show trial. He just reminded the nation, firmly, that law was not optional. Still, not everyone applauded. Jeffersonians accused him of using the military to silence political dissent. Even some Federalists worried what kind of precedent had just been set. But the swift end of the rebellion let Washington step down from the presidency on a high note. He had enforced the law without becoming a tyrant, shown strength without cruelty, and then withdrawn. Quietly, though, he understood this wouldn't be the last time the Republic would be tested. And next time, the outcome might not be so bloodless. Although the Whiskey Rebellion ended with barely a whimper, its echoes rippled far and wide politically, legally, and culturally. In hindsight, this dusty conflict over distilled grain was one of the most important constitutional stress tests in American history. First, it set a powerful precedent. The federal government had both the right and the means to enforce its laws, even in the face of violent defiance. Until that point, the Constitution had existed more as theory than practice. Under the Articles of Confederation, the government had been feeble and ineffective. But with Washington in the saddle, the Constitution gained teeth. Yet with that new strength came an undercurrent of fear. Many Americans, especially in rural areas, began to see the federal government not as their representative, but as a faraway elite that didn't understand or care about frontier life. The same people who had once raised glasses to the Revolution now whispered about oppression, not from London, but from Philadelphia and New York. Culturally, the Whiskey Rebellion became legend in Appalachia. Stories were passed down through generations, tales of brave farmers, moonshine stills, and federal agents driven back into the woods. Some of these stories were exaggerated. Some were outright fiction. But the message they carried was real. Government didn't always have your back. And sometimes, if you wanted to be heard, it took more than a ballot. It took a still, a rifle, and a few angry neighbors. Meanwhile, in the freshly planned capital of Washington, D.C., future lawmakers were taking notes. Every time unrest threatened the Republic, be it Shays' Rebellion, labor strikes, or civil rights marches, someone would invoke 1794. Was this how presidents should respond? A rapid show of federal strength followed by mercy? Or had Washington set a dangerous precedent and open door to military intervention in domestic affairs? Then there was the matter of the whiskey itself. Ironically, despite all the noise and marching, the tax never truly worked. It was expensive to enforce, easy to evade, and politically toxic. By the early 1800s, under President Jefferson, it was quietly repealed. The rebels had lost the battle, but in the eyes of many, they had won the war. Public opinion had turned. The frontier hadn't forgotten, and neither had the government. Future presidents facing protest, rebellion, and unrest would feel the ghost of 1794 at their backs. A reminder that order is fragile, that unity must be defended, and that the Republic is never far from tipping back into the chaos it once barely survived. The Whiskey Rebellion may seem like a curious footnote today, a quirky chapter in the early American story, but its legacy remains surprisingly alive, swirling like vapor off a still, influencing everything from presidential power to rural resistance. For one, it showed the American people that the Constitution wasn't just parchment and promises. It had muscle. This was the first time the federal government enforced a domestic law with troops, and the fact that it did so under the personal leadership of George Washington gave it historical gravity. Every president since has inherited that, preceding Lincoln, Eisenhower, even recent presidents deploying the National Guard during domestic unrest. All trace a faint line back to 1794 and a president on horseback. The rebellion also injected lasting skepticism into the heart of American politics. Frontier distrust of centralized government became a core part of U.S. political identity. It didn't matter that the rebellion failed. It proved to millions that distant elites could and would flex their power when it suited them. That spirit of rural defiance, you can still hear it in anti-tax protests, states' rights arguments, and the deep Athenian law. Women couldn't vote, own property independently, or represent themselves in court. They could not enter contracts or even leave the house without a male escort. In many cases, if the Code of Hammurabi defined women as legally subordinate, Athens perfected the art of locking them out entirely. Marriage was more of a property transaction than a romantic union. A woman's kurios, usually her father or brother, arranged her marriage, and she moved into her husband's household as part of an exchange of dowries and land. Legally, she was transferred like livestock, a living, breathing asset passed between men. And yet, paradoxically, her fidelity was of enormous legal importance. If an Athenian woman committed adultery, her husband could legally divorce her immediately, and any man caught with her could be executed. Yes, executed without trial. The irony: her husband could sleep with courtesans or slaves without legal repercussion. Double standards weren't just common. They were built into the legal structure. Women couldn't initiate divorce themselves, but they could return to their father's house if abandoned or mistreated. However, any legal action on their behalf had to be taken by a male relative. Even in cases of rape or assault, a woman could not bring charges. Her kurios had to speak for her. There were exceptions. In Sparta, women enjoyed more freedom. They could own land, receive education, and walk freely. But Spartan women were the anomaly, not the rule. In most city-states, a respectable woman's name was supposed to be spoken as little as possible. The ideal woman was modest, silent, and invisible. And yet, in the shadows of Greek law, women endured. They raised generations, managed households, and in some rare cases, wielded influence from behind the veil of legality. But officially, they weren't citizens. They were shadows in a system that prized logic and liberty from men only. In the world of ancient Rome, the law was a powerful instrument. And like everything else Ramam, it was deeply structured, hierarchical, and pragmatic. Roman women weren't equal citizens by any stretch, but compared to their Greek counterparts, they occupied a slightly more visible and legally complex space within society. At birth, a Roman woman fell under the patria potestas, or the absolute authority of her father. Upon marriage, that authority could either transfer to her husband manus marriage, or remain with her natal family sign manu marriage. The latter became increasingly common over time and allowed married women to retain legal ties to their original household and even manage property independently in some cases. This shift opened the door for women, especially widows or wealthy daughters, to own estates, manage businesses, and draft contracts. While women could not vote or hold office, they could sue in court often with a male sponsor act as guardians and accumulate wealth. Still, Roman law drew a firm line around female behavior. The ideal Roman woman was pudica, modest, loyal, and obedient. Adultery, once treated as a private offense, became a public crime under Augustus' moral reforms. A woman found guilty could lose her dowry, face exile, or worse. Meanwhile, a man's infidelity remained legally unprosecuted. Again, patriarchy rarely missed a chance to double down. However, unique roles offered exceptions. Vestals, the virgin priestesses of Vesta, were the only women legally free from male guardianship. They swore 30 years of chastity in exchange for immense prestige, legal independence, and the power to pardon condemned prisoners. But a broken vow of chastity meant being buried alive. Divine authority came with cruel consequences. Roman matrons, respectable married women of the upper classes, held significant social power. They influenced politics through family connections, arranged marriages, and even public mourning rituals. The legal system acknowledged their status through protections for property and legal mechanisms like tutela, a type of male guardianship that by the imperial period was often symbolic. So while Roman women lived within a legal cage, the bars were spaced just far enough apart to allow movement, especially for those born into wealth and prestige. They were constrained, yes, but never entirely silenced. In ancient Hebrew society, law wasn't merely a civic structure. It was divine instruction found in the Torah and later interpreted by rabbis. These religious legal texts created a framework that governed every aspect of life, including the roles, rights, and restrictions placed on women. And like many ancient systems, the law both elevated and limited them. At the heart of Hebrew law was the family unit, with women expected to serve as the moral and spiritual backbone of the household, but always under male authority. Fathers arranged marriages. Husbands were heads of households. Sons inherited land. Daughters, by contrast, were expected to marry out and bring a dowry with them, often with no inheritance rights unless there were no sons. However, women were far from voiceless. The ketubah, a marriage contract, gave them legal security in the form of promised financial support and spelled out responsibilities in marriage. If a man failed to provide food, clothing, or intimacy, a woman could seek divorce, a rare provision in the ancient world. But she couldn't initiate it directly. A rabbinic court or her male kin had to advocate on her behalf. Adultery laws were starkly unequal. A married woman caught with another man could be stoned to death according to Deuteronomic law. A man caught with a married woman faced the same punishment. But if the woman was unmarried or a slave, the rules became murkier, usually resulting in fines or marriage depending on the social status involved. In cases of rape, the law demanded a fine and marriage to the victim outcome that modern readers understandably find deeply problematic. Ritual purity laws also played a massive role in how women were legally perceived. During menstruation or childbirth, women were considered ritually impure and were temporarily restricted from religious life and physical contact. These laws reinforced ideas of female otherness, not necessarily as sinful, but as symbolically set apart. And yet, the Hebrew Bible is full of strong, legally significant women. Deborah, the judge. Ruth, the Moabite widow, who navigates the inheritance system. And Esther, who bends royal law to save her people. These women were rare, but their presence reveals that the law wasn't always airtight and that boldness, wisdom, and faith could sometimes make space where the law had closed a door. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, ruled over a vast, diverse population, from Babylonians and Egyptians to Greeks and Medes. And in that sprawling empire, Persian law operated with a level of tolerance and pragmatism uncommon in many ancient societies. This legal flexibility extended in interesting ways to women. While Persian law wasn't codified in a single monument like Hammurabi's Code, administrative records, court documents, and inscriptions reveal that women, especially elite women, had considerable legal presence. In particular, Persian royal and noble women were among the most autonomous in the ancient world. In the royal court, Women like Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great and mother of Xerxes, wielded immense influence. She controlled vast estates, issued commands to administrators, and appeared in imperial inscriptions not as decorative figures, but as landowners and power players. Records from the Persepolis fortification tablets show women receiving rations, managing work crews, and overseeing production in royal estates. These weren't isolated cases. High-ranking women, especially those close to the king, had legal authority over labor and property. Marriage and family law in Persia combined local customs with overarching imperial oversight. In Persian society, women could own property, enter contracts, and inherit land rights that were sometimes even more secure than in Greece or Rome. Dowries were legally protected, and women could reclaim them if the marriage ended. Divorce was possible for both men and women, though the process often leaned in favor of the husband unless serious abuse or infertility could be proven. Punishment laws, however, were still gendered. Adultery was a capital offense, especially for women. But unlike in some neighboring cultures, the method and severity of punishment varied by class. A noble woman might face exile or house arrest, while a servant could be executed. The law, as always, bowed to hierarchy. Zoroastrianism, the empire's dominant religion, also influenced Persian views on women. While spiritually, both men and women had roles in cosmic dualism, practical religious purity laws imposed restrictions on menstruation, childbirth, and bodily contact echoing patterns seen in Hebrew and Hindu systems. In all, Persian law offered women a curious mix: freedom through rank, respect through religion, and limits through custom. Athenian law: women couldn't vote, own property independently, or represent themselves in court. They could not enter contracts or even leave the house without a male escort. In many cases, if the Code of Hammurabi defined women as legally subordinate, Athens perfected the art of locking them out entirely. Marriage was more of a property transaction than a romantic union. A woman's curios, usually her father or brother, arranged her marriage, and she moved into her husband's household as part of an exchange of dowries and land. Legally, she was transferred like livestock, a living, breathing asset passed between men. And yet, paradoxically, her fidelity was of enormous legal importance. If an Athenian woman committed adultery, her husband could legally divorce her immediately, and any man caught with her could be executed. Yes, executed without trial. The irony: her husband could sleep with courtesans or slaves without legal repercussion. Double standards weren't just common. They were built into the legal structure. Women couldn't initiate divorce themselves, but they could return to their father's house if abandoned or mistreated. However, any legal action on their behalf had to be taken by a male relative. Even in cases of rape or assault, a woman could not bring charges. Her curios had to speak for her. There were exceptions. In Sparta, women enjoyed more freedom. They could own land, receive education, and walk freely. But Spartan women were the anomaly, not the rule. In most city-states, a respectable woman's name was supposed to be spoken as little as possible. The ideal woman was modest, silent, and invisible. And yet, in the shadows of Greek law, women endured. They raised generations, managed households, and in some rare cases, wielded influence from behind the veil of legality. But officially, they weren't citizens. They were shadows in a system that prized logic and liberty from men only. In the world of ancient Rome, the law was a powerful instrument. And like everything else, Ramam, it was deeply structured, hierarchical, and pragmatic. Roman women weren't equal citizens by any stretch, but compared to their Greek counterparts, they occupied a slightly more visible and legally complex space within society. At birth, a Roman woman fell under the patria potestas, or the absolute authority of her father. Upon marriage, that authority could either transfer to her husband manus marriage, or remain with her natal family sign manu marriage. The latter became increasingly common over time and allowed married women to retain legal ties to their original household and even manage property independently in some cases. This shift opened the door for women, especially widows or wealthy daughters, to own estates, manage businesses, and draft contracts. While women could not vote or hold office, they could sue in court often with a male sponsor act as guardians and accumulate wealth. Still, Roman law drew a firm line around female behavior. The ideal Roman woman was pudica, modest, loyal, and obedient. Adultery, once treated as a private offense, became a public crime under Augustus' moral reforms. A woman found guilty could lose her dowry, face exile, or worse. Meanwhile, a man's infidelity remained legally unprosecuted. Again, patriarchy rarely missed a chance to double down. However, unique roles offered exceptions. Vestals, the virgin priestesses of Vesta, were the only women legally free from male guardianship. They swore 30 years of chastity in exchange for immense prestige, legal independence, and the power to pardon condemned prisoners. But a broken vow of chastity meant being buried alive. Divine authority came with cruel consequences. Roman matrons, respectable married women of the upper classes, held significant social power. They influenced politics through family connections, arranged marriages, and even public mourning rituals. The legal system acknowledged their status through protections for property and legal mechanisms like tutela, a type of male guardianship that by the imperial period was often symbolic. So while Roman women lived within a legal cage, the bars were spaced just far enough apart to allow movement, especially for those born into wealth and prestige. They were constrained, yes, but never entirely silenced. In ancient Hebrew society, law wasn't merely a civic structure. It was divine instruction found in the Torah and later interpreted by rabbis. These religious legal texts created a framework that governed every aspect of life, including the roles, rights, and restrictions placed on women. And like many ancient systems, the law both elevated and limited them. At the heart of Hebrew law was the family unit, with women expected to serve as the moral and spiritual backbone of the household, but always under male authority. Fathers arranged marriages. Husbands were heads of households. Sons inherited land. Daughters, by contrast, were expected to marry out and bring a dowry with them, often with no inheritance rights unless there were no sons. However, women were far from voiceless. The ketubah, a marriage contract, gave them legal security in the form of promised financial support and spelled out responsibilities in marriage. If a man failed to provide food, clothing, or intimacy, a woman could seek divorce, a rare provision in the ancient world. But she couldn't initiate it directly. A rabbinic court or her male kin had to advocate on her behalf. Adultery laws were starkly unequal. A married woman caught with another man could be stoned to death according to Deuteronomic law. A man caught with a married woman faced the same punishment. But if the woman was unmarried or a slave, the rules became murkier, usually resulting in fines or marriage depending on the social status involved. In cases of rape, the law demanded a fine and marriage to the victim outcome that modern readers understandably find deeply problematic. Ritual purity laws also played a massive role in how women were legally perceived. During menstruation or childbirth, women were considered ritually impure and were temporarily restricted from religious life and physical contact. These laws reinforced ideas of female otherness, not necessarily as sinful, but as symbolically set apart. And yet, the Hebrew Bible is full of strong, legally significant women. Deborah, the judge; Ruth, the Moabite widow, who navigates the inheritance system; and Esther, who bends royal law to save her people. These women were rare, but their presence reveals that the law wasn't always airtight and that boldness, wisdom, and faith could sometimes make space where the law had closed a door. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, ruled over a vast, diverse population, from Babylonians and Egyptians to Greeks and Medes. And in that sprawling empire, Persian law operated with a level of tolerance and pragmatism uncommon in many ancient societies. This legal flexibility extended in interesting ways to women. While Persian law wasn't codified in a single monument like Hammurabi's Code, administrative records, court documents, and inscriptions reveal that women, especially elite women, had considerable legal presence. In particular, Persian royal and noble women were among the most autonomous in the ancient world. In the royal court, women like Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great and mother of Xerxes, wielded immense influence. She controlled vast estates, issued commands to administrators, and appeared in imperial inscriptions not as decorative figures, but as landowners and power players. Records from the Persepolis fortification tablets show women receiving rations, managing work crews, and overseeing production in royal estates. These weren't isolated cases. High-ranking women, especially those close to the king, had legal authority over labor and property. Marriage and family law in Persia combined local customs with overarching imperial oversight. In Persian society, women could own property, enter contracts, and inherit land rights that were sometimes even more secure than in Greece or Rome. Dowries were legally protected, and women could reclaim them if the marriage ended. Divorce was possible for both men and women, though the process often leaned in favor of the husband unless serious abuse or infertility could be proven. Punishment laws, however, were still gendered. Adultery was a capital offense, especially for women. But unlike in some neighboring cultures, the method and severity of punishment varied by class. A noble woman might face exile or house arrest, while a servant could be executed. The law, as always, bowed to hierarchy. Zoroastrianism, the empire's dominant religion, also influenced Persian views on women. While spiritually, both men and women had roles in cosmic dualism, practical religious purity laws imposed restrictions on menstruation, childbirth, and bodily contact echoing patterns seen in Hebrew and Hindu systems. In all, Persian law offered women a curious mix: freedom through rank, respect through religion, and limits through custom. The higher your status, the louder your legal voice. In ancient China, law was not just a system of rules. It was an expression of harmony, hierarchy, and Confucian morality. For women, this meant living within a legal and cultural framework that viewed them primarily through the lens of family roles and social duty rather than individual rights. The earliest codified Chinese laws appeared during the Zhou dynasty, but it was under the Han dynasty from 206 BCE to 220 CE. That legal structures began to crystallize alongside Confucian ideology. Confucian teachings emphasized the three obediences. A woman must obey her father before marriage, her husband during marriage, and her sons in widowhood. This wasn't just moral advice. It influenced actual legal expectations and societal norms. Women were legally subordinate to men in nearly all contexts. They could not hold public office, rarely appeared in court independently, and were often excluded from inheritance, especially in patrilineal families. A daughter might be cherished within the home, but the law saw her as temporary, for she would eventually marry out, taking her dowry with her. Marriage was both a family alliance and a legal contract. A man could divorce his wife for reasons as broad as jealousy or illness, though he could not do so if she had no family to return to, had mourned his parents properly, or had borne him sons. Women, by contrast, had no legal power to initiate divorce unless extreme abuse could be proven, and even then, her case would likely depend on her male relatives stepping in. Adultery laws reflected strong gender bias. A woman caught cheating could be executed, while a man cheating with a married woman might face punishment, but cheating with a servant or concubine was often overlooked entirely. Honor and legitimacy were tightly tied to the woman's womb. Still, there were exceptions. Some dynasties saw the rise of imperial women, like Empress Lao Ji and Empress Wu Zixin, who wielded immense political power, sometimes bending legal codes to suit their ambitions. In peasant villages, widows who managed households or took over family businesses could wield informal authority even if the law didn't formally recognize them. In short, ancient Chinese law saw women less as autonomous beings and more as stabilizers of familial order, vital to society's function, yet always second to the men who supposedly maintained its harmony. As we step back and look across the ancient world, from the ziggurats of Babylon to the palaces of Rome, from Vedic India to Confucian China, one thing becomes clear. Women were always written into the law, but rarely on their own terms. Nearly every ancient legal system assigned women a role within a male-dominated structure. Whether in Hammurabi's Code or the Manusmriti, the fundamental legal assumption was that a woman's identity was relational: daughter, wife, mother, widow. Her rights and responsibilities flowed through the men around her. Law defined her, but it rarely empowered her. Some civilizations like Egypt and Persia offered women more autonomy, allowing them to own property, initiate contracts, and even inherit wealth. In these societies, noble or highborn women could carve out pockets of legal authority, sometimes rivaling their male counterparts. But such privileges were far from universal. They depended on class, family, and circumstance more than any underlying belief in gender equality. Other societies like Greece and Rome developed sophisticated legal systems, while simultaneously fencing women out of public life. Greek women were legally invisible. Roman women had more agency, but still lived within a scaffold of male guardianship and social expectation. In China, Confucian values hardened the ideal of obedient femininity into legal expectation. The law wasn't just about punishment. It was about preserving cosmic harmony. And that meant everyone, especially women, knew their place in the social order. Similarly, in Hindu law, reverence for women coexisted uncomfortably with strict control and moral prescription. Religious laws such as Jewish halakha or Zoroastrian purity codes often placed women at the intersection of sacred and profane. A woman's body could bring honor or impurity, blessing or danger, depending on how closely she followed the rules. And yet, within these systems, women adapted, resisted, and endured. They found ways to exercise influence through family, faith, property, or sheer determination. Their stories may not always be carved into stone, steel, or echoed in ancient law courts, but they moved beneath the surface, shaping households, dynasties, and entire civilizations. Ultimately, ancient legal codes tell us not only how societies treated women, but how they defined power itself and who they believed deserved to wield it. Long before Wall Street, before vaults and banknotes and savings accounts, banking began in the mud-brick cities of ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. And surprisingly, the first bankers weren't suited financiers, they were priests. In cities like Uruk, Lagash, and later Babylon, temples weren't just religious centers. They were the administrative and economic hearts of urban life. These towering ziggurats and their surrounding complexes acted as both spiritual sanctuaries and financial hubs. Farmers and merchants didn't just come to pray. They came to deposit grain, receive loans, and settle debts. Why temples? Because they were the most stable, trusted institutions. The gods didn't run off with your money, and the priesthood had an army of scribes to keep meticulous records. When a farmer delivered a portion of his harvest to the temple granary, he'd receive a clay tablet with a uniform inscription: the quantity stored, the date, the depositor's name, and sometimes a witness. This wasn't just a receipt. It was an early form of a check. These receipts could then be transferred. A farmer in debt could hand over his tablet to a creditor as repayment. A merchant could use them to buy goods or settle accounts. In this way, the clay tablet became the ancestor of promissory notes, deposit slips, and I owe us. Temples also issued loans, not just in grain, but in silver, sheep, and other commodities. Interest rates were high by modern standards, typically around 20% for grain and 33% for silver. These weren't casual transactions either. Defaulting on a temple loan could lead to the loss of land, property, or even personal freedom. Interestingly, the concept of compound interest was understood and feared. Some legal codes, like those of Hammurabi, tried to limit or regulate interest practices. Others formalized debt slavery as a punishment. This was banking in its rawest, most primal form, both brilliant and brutal. So while modern banks might be glass towers and spreadsheets, their bones are ancient. The earliest financial systems weren't born in markets. They were born in temples. And in Mesopotamia, the gods didn't just judge your soul, they also balanced your books. By the time Babylon rose to power under kings like Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, Mesopotamian banking had become more sophisticated and more personal. While temples and palaces remained important economic players, a new class of financial professionals began to emerge: private moneylenders. These early financiers weren't working out of marble lobbies. They conducted business in humble homes, market stalls, or even beside temple courtyards. But they had one thing temples didn't: flexibility. Where temple loans were often seasonal and tied to agricultural cycles, private moneylenders could tailor deals for merchants, traders, and craftsmen, offering loans in Silver, Babylon's preferred unit of currency. Silver wasn't minted into coins, yet that innovation would come much later. Instead, it was weighed out by the shekel, and loans were documented on clay tablets. These tablets detailed the borrower, lender, amount lent, interest rate, repayment date, and sometimes even collateral. If a debtor defaulted, lenders could legally seize land, goods, or even family members. Some contracts read more like threats than agreements. One fascinating innovation was the rise of joint liability loans, where two or more individuals shared responsibility for repayment. This helped reduce the lender's risk and planted the seeds for what we now call co-signed loans. Debt was everywhere in Babylonian society. Farmers borrowed to plant crops. Merchants borrowed to finance caravan expeditions, and builders took loans for large construction projects. Debt slavery was a real risk, but the law eventually began to push back. Hammurabi's famous code offered some relief. For example, if a storm destroyed your crops, you might be exempted from interest that season. These stamped pieces marked a profound shift from weighed metal to standardized currency. No longer did traders have to measure silver chunks in dusty markets. Now, value could be verified at a glance. Other civilizations quickly adopted the idea. The Greeks minted drachmas, the Persians issued darics, and the Romans built an entire empire on denarii. These coins bore state symbols, images of gods or rulers, and inscriptions, not just to represent value, but to signal legitimacy and control. A coin was as much a piece of propaganda as it was a financial tool. With state-backed coinage came new financial behaviors. Hoards of coins were stored in temples, households, and merchant treasuries. Lending became easier and more portable. Coins could circulate quickly across city-states, and with uniform weights and metal content, traders could move goods across borders with confidence. Early bankers, from Mesopotamian lenders to Roman argentieri, adapted to this new certainty. They no longer needed to test weights or purity as frequently. Instead, they tracked coins by type, year, and issuer. This consistency reduced transaction friction, expanded trade routes, and made loans more predictable. Coinage also played a role in inflation and monetary policy, albeit in crude forms. Rulers could debase coins by mixing cheaper metals into the mix, stretching the treasury but undermining trust. Roman emperors famously did this to pay their armies, triggering cycles of devaluation and economic instability. Still, the idea stuck. Currency backed by a state, stamped with its symbol and guaranteed in value. This concept laid the groundwork for everything from medieval gold coins to modern fiat money. In a way, each ancient coin was more than just a piece of metal. It was a promise, a contract, and a tool of empire. It told you not only how much something was worth, but who had the power to decide. In the ancient world, the line between faith and finance was often thin, if it existed at all. Temples didn't just serve the gods. They also served as the earliest safe deposit boxes, banks, and loan offices. Why? Because people trusted the gods far more than they trusted kings, merchants, or wandering moneylenders. Take Delphi, for instance. The sanctuary of Apollo wasn't just a religious destination, it was a financial powerhouse. City-states stored war funds there. Wealthy individuals deposited fortunes, and treasuries were built within temple precincts. Religious centers like Delos, Ephesus, and Jerusalem also acted as de facto banks, offering security, prestige, and scribes who kept careful records. A vault under divine watch was seen as safer than any home or fortress. These temples played several financial roles. They held deposits, issued loans, and in some cases even collected interest. In Mesopotamia, as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, temple priests oversaw lending systems where borrowers were paid with grain or silver. In Egypt, temple granaries stored wealth, issued receipts, and facilitated trade. In Greece and Rome, temples frequently held public funds, safeguarded spoils of war, and underwrote construction and festivals, all under the sacred seal of a deity. And temples weren't just passive vaults. They actively lent money. In Athens, for example, the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis loaned silver to the state at interest to fund major public works. Gods, apparently, were patient creditors. Religion also provided the ethical framework for finance. Ancient Hebrew law, for instance, prohibited charging interest to fellow Israelites, but allowed it for foreigners, a moral boundary blending spiritual identity with economic policy. Hindu Dharma texts laid out rules for fair lending, debt repayment, and even the spiritual consequences of financial misconduct. Of course, these systems weren't without flaws. Temples could be looted in wartime. Clerics could be corrupt. But for most of the ancient world, temples were the most trusted institutions enduring, stable, and reinforced by divine fear. So when you picture ancient banking, don't just imagine dusty coins and cloaked lenders. Picture golden statues, incense, and marble columns. Because for thousands of years, the safest place to put your money wasn't under a mattress. It was beneath the watchful eyes of the gods. Long before the invention of credit cards or mortgage calculators, ancient economies ran on a system surprisingly familiar. Borrow now, pay later, with interest. Whether you were a Mesopotamian farmer, a Greek merchant, or a Roman senator, if you needed capital, you went to a lender. But the ancient rules of lending were often harsher, and the consequences of default far more personal. Interest wasn't just allowed, it was expected. In Babylon, rates were steep, 20% for grain, 33% for silver, often compounded annually. These figures weren't considered predatory. They were standard. High risk meant high reward, and borrowers understood that if the harvest failed or a caravan didn't return, they were still on the hook. Temples and private lenders alike made fortunes off these loans. Unpaid debt could lead to debt slavery or seizure of property. In ancient Greece, especially Athens, interest rates varied depending on the risk involved. The riskiest loans were maritime loans. A lender might front silver to fund a trading voyage, knowing the ship might sink or be seized by pirates. To offset the risk, rates could soar to 100% or more. But if the ship returned safely, both merchant and lender could make a killing. The Romans added legal muscle to these arrangements. Loan contracts were written, witnessed, and sealed. Collateral land, goods, slaves was recorded in detail. Miss a payment, and your creditor could take you to court, seize your property, or, in rare cases, force you into bonded labor. Roman law set a 12% interest cap, but loopholes and exemptions made that number flexible, especially during times of economic stress. Despite the risk, borrowing was common. Farmers borrowed seed, merchants borrowed to buy goods, politicians borrowed to fund their campaigns. Lending greased the gears of ancient economies, and default was an accepted hazard. And yes, fraud and manipulation were part of the game. Lenders sometimes demanded bribes or added administrative fees. Borrowers could lie about collateral or disappear entirely. Without credit scores or banking regulations, trust and reputation were everything. In the end, ancient loans weren't just financial tools, they were power plays. To borrow was to risk more than money. It was to stake your land, your freedom, sometimes even your family on the chance that tomorrow would be better, or at least profitable. From grain receipts in Mesopotamia to the silver ledgers of Rome, ancient banking wasn't just a footnote in economic history. It was the foundation. These early systems of deposits, loans, interest, and financial record-keeping didn't just fuel local trade. They quietly shaped the architecture of global finance. At the heart of every ancient banking system was the same challenge we face today: trust. Could people trust that the weight of silver was fair? That the grain in the temple granary wouldn't spoil or vanish? That the lender wouldn't disappear with their deposit? And out of that trust, or the desperate need for it, rose record-keeping, contracts, and ultimately institutional finance. The innovations were astonishing for their time. Ancient Babylonians developed loan contracts with fixed interest, repayment terms, and legal witnesses, all inscribed in uniform. Ancient Greeks pioneered letters of credit, allowing funds to be transferred between city-states without carrying coins. The Romans created bankers' associations and formalized debt enforcement in civil law, building a financial system that could stretch from Britain to Syria. Even today, echoes of ancient banking remain. The modern check evolved from Mesopotamian clay receipts. The concept of collateralized loans is rooted in Babylonian and Roman practices. Central banking and monetary policy trace their ancestry back to rulers who manipulated coin purity or temple wealth to fund armies and public projects. And what about regulation? It turns out ancient societies understood financial crisis all too well. In Babylon, kings periodically declared debt forgiveness to prevent social collapse. Roman emperors sometimes imposed interest caps to curb predatory lending. These weren't just economic decisions. They were political acts aimed at keeping society balanced and stable. But perhaps the greatest legacy of ancient banking is the realization that finance is not new. The tools have changed. Clay tablets became spreadsheets. Silver shekels became digital currencies. But the fundamental human behaviors remain: risk, ambition, trust, fear, and the hope of gain. The next time you log into your bank app or swipe a credit card, remember, you're not doing anything new. You're participating in a system that began with scribes in temples, coins stamped by kings, and farmers betting their harvest on a better season. And it all began with a simple idea: sometimes to build the future, you have to borrow from it.